Hello, everyone. Welcome to this third installment of our Advent Your Week at St. Luke's, or Your Week with St. Luke's. We're so glad you're joining us. We're having a conversation again about our book, The Christmas in the Four Gospels. And today we're talking about the Gospel of Luke and its birth narrative. And as we've done with the other two, we want to review a little bit. So let's remember what we've learned about Luke so far. It was written around 80 to 90. It was written for everyone. It's very inclusive. It starts off with kind of a salutation to lovers of God. So this is really where the Gospels begin to push out beyond the Jewish community. It's really about putting the past, present, and future together. If you look at the very first first paragraph of chapter 1, he speaks that others have undertaken the writing down the orderly account. So he's giving a nod to, of course, Mark and probably Matthew as well, but also others that weren't chosen to be a part of the canon of Scripture. But he's like, I too have investigated everything carefully, and I want to tell you what my version of this whole Jesus story is. So if you remember in Luke's gospel too, he's writing to the marginalized. Poor is not poor in spirit. It is poor. He's talking to people who are impoverished, people who are broken, people who are Gentiles, people who are outcast. And it's all about Jesus reaching out to those as well and inviting us into this kingdom experience where everyone is welcome. And of course, Luke is our namesake gospel. That's who we were written after. And some say that Luke, the writer of Luke, was the great physician. And I only bring that up to say that's always been kind of a tagline for St. Luke's over the last 20 plus years is help, hope, and healing. And so that's important to kind of who we are. So whether or not that's true, we set that context for who we are. So I'm going to ask the other pastors, tell us kind of what's your favorite parts of Luke and the Jesus you've met in Luke?
I have always loved Luke because Luke, I think of the four gospels as the best storyteller. You get most of your favorite parables. You get a lot of the stories that that I love. You know, you get the prodigal son, you get stories of table fellowship and parties and who's invited and bringing people together in that way. So I love Luke because it's where you find some of the best stories.
And along with that, there's more character development, right? So Mark starts with John. John's fully grown. He's, wearing his camel cloth, and Luke, we get the birth of John. We get more character development. We get to understand more, and even like we have more characters, like the journey to Emmaus. The two, we don't know who they are, but there's something else happening there. Like there's a bigger world that Jesus is impacting that Luke gives us a picture of.
Yeah, I'd say for me, it might be that Luke expands into Acts, right? So we get to see the journey of disciples starting with Jesus and then starting the church and how it connects to us. Kind of like it fits with what you said about what the gospel does. It combines and brings together past, present, and future. That the gospel expands that way into another book in the Old Testament might be my favorite thing about Luke.
Yeah, and I think in that same vein, it also, I think, does the best job of inviting us into the story, because we are that future. We are, knowing that there is a future beyond this gospel. We can both see that as the book of Acts, but also see that as ourselves.
Right.
Yep, for sure.
I like the Jesus that's there because I think all, like what you've said, the storytelling, but and some of my favorite stories and favorite parables are in the Gospel of Luke. But there are stories that push kingdom of God, social justice narrative, even though, again, Sermon on the Mount said Matthew more. Luke is a little bit different in the way he says it. The stories that are told are like ones that like push the narrative or push the understanding or push this gospel of good news for everyone. And when you sit with those texts, make you hear them beyond yourself.
Yeah.
I think it's a less personal gospel for me. where when we talk about John next week, John's a very personal gospel as a disciple for me. This is this is the community beyond disciples. Honestly, it's the community of the people of God in humanity, and how are we a part of that for me?
Yeah.
So tell us about the birth narrative, because it's also my favorite birth narrative. It's got all the details and it's got all the trimmings for me.
And there's this bigger preamble, right? There's all this other stuff that's happening. We learn about, we learn more about Jesus' relationship with John, that they're cousins, and Elizabeth and
Jesus isn't the first miraculous birth in this story. So
that's right.
So, it's things came. It's a different way than Matthew does to say some things came before. But to see, Jesus' birth is miraculous also because John's birth was miraculous, and then the connection between the two of them. And it's not just that John heralded Jesus, but they made a connection in the womb, and those stories of Zechariah and Elizabeth and Mary and all of that. It really, really is interesting. We did a lot with those stories a couple years ago in Advent, and just really getting to dig in to what we often skip over. In the same way we skip over the genealogy in Matthew, we skip over the stories that come before Jesus' birth that give you, again, that rising action, as you would say in literature, to make his birth the climax. So
I would also say you see that Matthew influence in the way that, just like you were saying, Matthew's goal being to establish a connection between Jesus and the story of Israel so far and God's relationship with people. The story of John the Baptist's birth, right, connects to or mirrors what happened with Abraham and Sarah. And so it's like these formulas of introducing stories that mirror stories that we know and that prove the power of God, right? To create legitimacy from a perspective of history, but also, like Jen said, push out to the Gentiles and retell the story.
Right. And then also with this kind of pre-part, this chapter 1, we get this beautiful response of Mary, which answers the question that a guy wrote in Pretty Song. Yeah, she knew. Right? She sings this Magnificat, right? That this response to understanding what's going to be happening, and that's only in Luke that kind of, again, sets the tone for the birth narrative in chapter 2.
Well, and I love the fact, and it's in our book on page 29. It's I always think of it whenever I read Luke, and I'm not, don't anybody here, I'm trying to make it into a fairy tale, but I always think of the beginning of Beauty and the Beast, tale as old as time. Like, it sets it in history. It says, when this person was governor, and Augustus and all the Caesar Augustus and all those things, which makes it feel like this is real, folks. This is not just, this happened on a hillside, pretty little fairy tale, but this is real. And I love what our writer says. It says, Luke is writing long after Caesar Augustus was dead, but the empire continued. So Luke is trying to say, this is happening against what's going on in the real world. And it matters. The writer says, it was even stamped on the money, Caesar Augustus, son of God. That's the setting in which the angel sang, the heavenly music that floats over a weary world is not just a pious sentiment. It is a statement about who is really God. So you've got this, like, here's the empire, and here's what's going on in your world. And I love that today. Like, here's what's going on with Senate races and House races, and who's going to be run for president and all that stuff, and we get so wrapped up in that, and then we often go, okay, now I'm going to go do Christmas, and it's my faith journey is separate. And Luke is going, no, it's in the middle of it. This reminds you who God is, and God is bigger than these people. And again, that's where I love that whole, the story is the story, and it makes you feel like lost sheep and lost brothers, but it's not.
And that's where we get into that historical piece of what's going on for them. You know, that no matter how you date this, it is after the temple was destroyed. And so not only is this a people who is hearing stories of their God who has been killed in some way and hopefully resurrected if they read the whole story, right? But they have now just seen the centerpiece of sort of their faith institution destroyed, and are trying to figure out where you center your faith again. And so and then bring in people for whom that temple wasn't important, the Gentile community, and how do you create a whole new system? And so it is important for the Jewish part of this audience to connect. Okay, no, it was part of this too, but also the future. But also we're going somewhere. It's still the same God. That God is still present. That God is still working, and brings everyone together in that way.
Yeah, at the end of that paragraph, he says, "For unto you is born this day in the city of David, a backwater, nothing village to the Romans, but ground zero of Israel's greatest king. A savior who is Christ the Messiah, the Lord." And all those imperial titles, Luke tells us, really belong to the newborn child. And you read that and you remember that and you're like, God, it's like mic drop kind of like, oh, and by the way, all the stuff you're worried about, it has nothing to do with what's really going on in the world. I love that.
So on Sunday, we are going to get an introduction into Luke's house at Christmas. And if Mark was a challenge for you, because there wasn't much, and maybe you liked Matthew a little bit, I think Luke is going to feel the most comfortable, most likely. Luke is going to be the house that you find the most Christmas tradition in, the most Christmas comfort in, because Luke's house is where all of the symbols are there. All of the things you want at Christmas are there. The lights and the garland and the ornaments and the cookies and the smells and the comfortable blankets that you only pull out at Christmas, and all of the things that just make you can say it's superficial, but let's be real, like it does bring something up in our hearts when we get to drive around and look at Christmas lights. There is just something important about that, and it changes how we feel in the season. And at the center of it all, you have this nativity, either a nativity set or just the picture or the story that centers in the midst of all of it, because this is the story where you get the baby in the manger and the turning away from the inn and the journey. And again, the miraculous birth, both with Elizabeth and with Mary, and the Magnificat, and all of these things that when you think about Christmas, these are the words and the phrases and the stories that you think of. And so Luke's house, the writer talks about, he says, "For Luke, I long to draw a house that conjured those same positive emotions. The smell of delicious food being prepared, the sound of children playing, and the warmth of family gathered together." So there's something also about Luke's house that does become an inclusive space where everyone is welcome, everyone can feel comfortable, and there's a place at the table for everybody. So we'll see that a little bit this Sunday. So what about y'all? Is that the house that you're the most comfortable with? Does that bring you joy and excitement?
I mean, I love, so the wraparound porch, it's got a big front porch, the artist one, but I think of a wraparound porch of a home that has, and that the house doesn't begin when you go in through the front door. The house begins further out, right? And I think the author also talked about children playing in the front yard with all the animals, and there's that openness to it, which I love. I love that idea of the house begins before you even walk in the door. It's already out there, right? So I resonate deeply with that.
I mean, I'm being quiet because everyone knows this is my favorite one.
Jen, you're gonna be jumping out of your skin, like, yes, this is it.
I mean, you might see that on Sunday too. Yeah, I'm cool with it.
It's kind of your vibe. It's
It
your
is.
thing.
It is. It's funny. It's funny too, because I spent Thanksgiving taking my mom back and getting her house ready for Christmas, and then my mother-in-law came to my mother's house, And my mother-in-law was just like, because they don't do Christmas, because they always used to go to Durham. And my mother-in-law was like, wow, there's just so much. And I'm like, yeah. And I realized I don't think my dad always decorated a lot for Christmas, but not to the extent that we do now. Like that got worse and worse and worse. And it's my fault. It's because I worked at stores and Christmas shops and things like that. And so I would bring all this stuff home, and I would be the one like in high school and in college, like tearing our house apart and putting we don't need this picture. Let's put up a Christmas picture. And I feel sort of responsible for my mother's obsession with it. So now my mom doesn't maybe remember it that way, but I'm like, yeah, it's kind of my fault. Because there's a sense of stability in it for me. Because Christmas, to be fair, to be perfectly vulnerable and honest, Christmas, there were some Christmases that were difficult in my family, very difficult. And what was steady and beautiful in the midst of it, kind of like what the Gospel of Luke is saying, is that there's this mysterious gift that happens, gift of blessing and joy and love and peace and hope that happens in the midst of darkness and in the midst of brokenness. And that's what it represents for me. That's why I do all of the stuff, is because no matter how bad things can be in the world around us, there can still be beauty and hope and joy that's centered in this story.
Right.
Go ahead, Jeremy.
Just saying that I think that we have to remember, especially as Methodists, that we are both and people. I guess what you said earlier, that some people could see it as shallow or surface, but we're both and people. And so there's room for us to consider how decorating our surroundings affects who we are inside, and also for us to wander in the longing and the waiting and the mystery of the season that can sometimes be uncomfortable. There's room for both if we let there be. That's all I was going to say. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think one of the things, and we'll talk about this some on Sunday too, we talked about with Mark, that Mark is the more is coming, look at after Christmas, and Luke invites us to look after Christmas too, but in a different way, in a way that grounds you in the present and grounds you in the story of this birth narrative, but also how that then, because we include Zechariah and Elizabeth, because we include the Magnificat, because those pieces are included, it's not just about this birth. It is about how this birth now is leading into a bigger story. And so while a lot of our favorite pieces of Christmas are in the Luke story, Luke doesn't end the story there. In some way, Matthew doesn't end the story there either, but there's a completion for the birth in Matthew, whereas for Luke, this is a waypoint in a much bigger story, and leads us into where God's movement is going to keep going.
Yeah, well, because Luke then takes us to, right after the birth, takes us to the temple. Right.
The only place we get any of Jesus's childhood.
You have all these powerful, so it's there's less gaps, right? And that's what we were saying before. There's a fuller thing, and this is because, like Jen, you're saying, there's a fuller story here by why I decorate. There's more going on here under the surface. That's powerful.
Well, and I think it's interesting because each of the characters. Each of the people, in Luke's birth story, it is set up to how will you respond to the incarnation? So how will you proclaim? How will you be an evangelist? We're afraid of that word. And yet the shepherds are evangelists, Zechariah is evangelist, Anna's, everyone has to proclaim the good news in an inspirational way that let's go tell everybody else.
Yeah.
Or how are we going to be social justice advocates? How are we going to take this birth and be the people who live out the Magnificat? There's only two responses to the incarnation. Well, right. Three. There's three. There's contemplative too, because Mary takes all this and ponders it in her heart. There's a contemplative piece, there's an evangelism piece, and there's a social justice piece. These are the three ways you respond to the incarnation of Christ among us, period. End of the story. You got to do something with it.
Yeah.
And I love that. I love that old Skit Guys video that we used to show about, wait, hold on, I'm going to keep my Christmas lights all year long, because we should, as Charles Dickens said, he kept Christmas very well, and it should be all year long.
Yeah.
Inviting people to the porch, to the house, right? Inviting people. It's a very invitational gospel and nativity birth.
So
I might actually change my answer about which thing is my favorite to the Magnificat, and just kind of the initial interaction between Elizabeth and Mary, just in the way that you talk about structures that are oppressive being torn down, and the low being brought high, and the high being brought low, to this equality. And in their interaction, we see Mary, or Elizabeth, who's older, and we talk about age being a hierarchical system both then and now. We see Elizabeth say, why do I receive the honor of having the mother of the Lord in my presence, right? And so we already see those systems and those hierarchies even before Jesus gets going. You know what I mean? But with Mary's song, and with Elizabeth's response to Mary, we see those things begin to topple. And that even is speaking to us as the future church. How come we don't take that example and privilege and honor the perspective and place and vocation and all those kind of things of young folks? I mean, I'm sure we do, you know what I mean? But as a larger culture, why don't we listen to and elevate the voices of our young folks? Mary was probably about 14.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we think about that house welcoming everyone in, we see Jews and Gentiles in Luke's context, but we can expand that. We can think about whose voices aren't being heard here now too. So let me wrap us up with the last few words from this particular chapter in the book. I hope you're reading the book, so this might be something hopefully you read already. But it says, this house invites us in to be with or to become family. That seems to be Luke's primary theme. For Luke, Jesus came to bring the kingdom of God to all people, meeting them where they are. It's a perspective that recognizes how God's family needs to grow beyond one tribe or nation to better align with God's vision of family. All people must be made to feel welcome and loved. So we'll be showing a little bit of what that looks like this Sunday in worship, and visiting Luke's house. And so I hope that you will join us then and see how you feel about Luke's living room. So we'll see you then.